Good morning, good evening, wherever you might be, whichever part of the world you may be. I am going to talk to you about one interpretation of Chinese medicine. Notice I have put in the title, one interpretation, for the simple reason that my understanding of Chinese medicine is necessarily very, very restricted and limited. For a start, I am not a practitioner of the medicine. So in a sense, not being a practitioner is a big, big drawback for anybody to comment on the medicine. So if you forgive me for that limitation, I would then have the courage to go on to give you my understanding of the medicine. Secondly, not only am I not a practitioner of the medicine, I suffer from another limitation, and that is my knowledge of the theoretical side of the medicine is also necessarily limited. Limited for several reasons, because I am not a scholar of classical Chinese, and so I try to read the texts, but because I'm not a scholar, I could have made mistakes, which I must have, for all I know. So do please bear in mind all these limitations from which I suffer, and that is why always remember it is simply one interpretation, and I could be wrong. So I won't be offended if you tell me that I've gone wrong, because that is how we learn. So with these restrictions explained, perhaps I can now go on. Now, many of you would no doubt have heard about Joseph Needham because of his tremendous pioneering work on Chinese science and technology. Now, in his writing, Needham said he put forward a question, he posed a question, which could be called a $64,000 question, however you like to characterize it, in which he says, he raised a puzzle, in other words. He said, Chinese technology and science towards the end, by the end of the Ming Dynasty, for instance, were infinitely more advanced than Western science and Western technology. But why is it that the Chinese never developed science in the way that the West did? So he himself even tried to answer this question, and many other people have also tried to answer that question. But I think that there is a flaw in the question he posed. It is the wrong question to pose. The question he posed was, why did not the Chinese develop science in the way that the West had? Now, this is the crucial thing, because my criticism of the Needham question is that he has posed the wrong question, because the reality, it seems to me, in my limited understanding of the field, because I'm not an expert like he was, is that the Chinese did develop science after all. It's just that their paradigm of scientificity is not the same as the Western or the European paradigm of scientificity. In other words, where Needham had gone wrong seems to me to be this, that he had assumed what I call essentialism of method. This is to say, he assumed, and lots of people assume this, that there's only one essential way of doing science. And naturally, that essential way is the way undertaken by the European paradigm of scientificity. Now, I think this is wrong. First of all, there is the postulate of essentialism of method is basically wrong, because there are different paradigms of doing science, different ways, different methods, different assumptions involved in every science. So I want to say that the Chinese did have science. It's just not the same paradigm of scientificity than the European or the Western model. Now, the next point you've got to bear in mind is this. I am now assuming, for the purpose of this talk, that medicine may cover a lot of aspects. There, some people would even want to say that you are wrong to think that medicine is a science. Now, I think one would be wrong to say that medicine is a science full stop, but it may not be wrong to say that medicine claims itself to be scientific. Certainly, Western medicine claims itself to be terribly scientific. Chinese medicine had never bothered to make such a claim. All that I'm saying is that in order to make sense of the text of Chinese medicine, you need to assume that what they are saying constitutes a science, but a science not in the simple-minded understanding of science in the Western model of scientificity, but in the Chinese model of scientificity, which is a much more complex model. Now then, so today in my talk, I would like to take you through some of the differences between the two paradigms of scientificity that presumed by the Western model of science, and therefore the medicine which it is, of which it is a part, as opposed to the Chinese paradigm of scientificity, of which its medicine is also a part. So in other words, what I am saying too is that there is a very close link between the paradigm of scientificity and the philosophical tradition in which the science is embedded. Because in my understanding of science, every science, no matter what it is, presupposes is embedded within a particular philosophical framework. So in other words, to understand the science, the paradigm of scientificity, you've got to understand the philosophical tradition in which it is embedded. Now you can already begin to see a complexity that although one is talking about science, medicine as a science, you must simultaneously also bear in mind that that science is embedded within its own philosophical tradition. So Western medicine as a science is therefore embedded within the Western medical tradition. Now, I'm not going to talk about the history of Western medicine because it has undergone a lot of changes, because the philosophy, Western philosophy has changed. We're now talking about modern Western science, which began in the 17th century, Western medicine, which couldn't be said to have begun in the 17th century, but it began much later, but it's still embedded in the modern Western philosophical tradition. But in contrast, Chinese medicine, therefore Chinese medicine as a science, is embedded in a Chinese philosophical tradition. But this tradition, unlike the Western tradition, did not suffer any rupture. I mean, Chinese philosophy has a long, long history, a history of more than 2,000, probably, I would venture to say at least 3,000 years. I don't want to put a specific date to it, but it's a long, long history compared to a modern Western philosophical tradition, which began roughly, say, with Descartes in the 17th century. So they're very, very different philosophical traditions. So today then, I want to share with you, to draw your attention to some of the different aspects of the philosophy of these two traditions, and to account, therefore, for the differences in the two types of medicine as science. I will speak about ontology and tell you that Western medicine, modern Western medicine, today would be called biomedicine, which began in the 17th century. Actually, this has what I call thing ontology. In other words, it is based on thing. Now, thing is easy. So just remember thing, even if you don't want to know about ontology. But a thing is just something, like a book, a table, a mountain, a tree. These are things, right? The planets we see, we talk about in our own solar system, these are all things. And atom is also a thing. So I'm going to talk about things as opposed to processes. So that is why I call one thing ontology and the other process ontology. So what is a process? Now, to understand a process, you just simply have to think of events. So events are processes. For instance, it's easier to understand process and events if you think of an organism. Think of an acorn, an oak acorn. An oak acorn is the fruit of the oak tree. Now, or the seed of the oak tree. So an acorn, if it happens to fall on good grounds, on grounds which can sustain its growth, would soon sprout forth a little sapling, a little tree, a shoot, and it will grow and grow. So the process of growth, of development, of maturity, and finally of decay and death, all these are processes. So that's why you have a thing on the one hand and process on the other. Now, I want to say that Western medicine, the paradigm of Western medicine, is primarily based on thing, an object that you can touch. You can, for Western science, it's better if you can quantify it, you can measure it because it's a quantitative science. So it's all about things. Primarily, not exclusively, perhaps be fair to it, but primarily the focus is on thing. But the Chinese model of doing science, and therefore of doing its medicine, is to focus primarily, not so much on things, but on processes, on events. And so you can see immediately a difference. Not only does it differ therefore in their ontologies, in their respective ontologies, but they also differ in their models of causality. Now, so I would simply say that Western medicine and Western science, or at least Newtonian science, let me qualify it, which is based on thing, is also based on a model which is what I call monofactorial. That is, if you look at the diagram here, you can see, it is one cause, one effect. One cause, one effect. So that is why it is a linear, what I call a linear monofactorial model of causation. Now, if you look at Chinese medicine and Chinese science, in which the medicine is embedded, it is not like that at all. It is what I call non-linear. So, but very, very quickly, you can see it as something like, now, of course, Wu Xing, which Chinese medicine and Chinese philosophy focuses on, is a non-linear model. So you can see how complicated it is, whereas the other unidirectional, one cause, one effect model is quite simple, whereas this is very, very complicated. So it is non-linear. Now, I'll come back to some of these differences in detail later, but that sort of sets up very, very quickly the two very different paradigms of scientificity in which their medicine is embedded. Now, let us look at what a very ancient Chinese dictionary have to say. And this particular dictionary is called 说文解字 by Xi Sheng. The ancient texts which are considered to be foundational are, of course, the Huangdi Neijing, the Neijing. The other is Zhang Zhoujing's Shanghai Jia Bing Lun. In the two texts, talk between them of three causal conditions for the occurrence of an epidemic. Now, the three factors or conditions are, I put down here A, yi du, which may be translated as epidemic toxin, or du qi, or toxic qi. Now, this very quickly is because there's a tremendous difference in the way that Zhongyi understands illnesses in general and the illness incurred in an epidemic in particular. And that is Zhongyi, as I've said in my earlier lecture, is not interested in the disease as a disease entity. It is interested in what, not so much in what I call thing ontology. A disease entity is a thing, therefore it is focusing on thing ontology. But Zhongyi focuses on processes or events, both internal to the person and external to the person in the greater environment in which the person resides. So events and processes, therefore, are to do with process ontology. It is not excluding thing ontology, but it doesn't overstress it, if you see what I mean. Whereas in biomedicine, the whole thing is on thing ontology. So to understand any disease, you've got to find out what is the virus. In the case of this particular epidemic, it is a virus. In the case of other epidemics, it could be a bacterium or bacteria. So virus, bacteria, bits of DNA, DNA usually may not produce, would not produce an epidemic, but you know what I mean. They're interested in a bit of matter which is causing the disease, whereas Zhongyi is not particularly interested. It keeps an eye on it, but it by and large talks about qi, and qi emphasizes processes. So qi, therefore, it's more to do with physiological processes rather than with the disease entity. So apart from the yidu or the du qi or whatever, however you refer to it, as toxic qi or epidemic toxin, the other cause, there are two causes, two types of deficiencies, nei shi and wai shi. Nei shi is internal deficiency, and wai shi is external deficiency. Now, nei shi is, the Chinese Zhongyi says that for an illness to occur, what you need, what is a basic premise which has to be satisfied, basic condition which has to be satisfied, is that the righteous qi or the zheng qi in the human, the person body, in the person, is deficient or compromised in some way. And when your zheng qi is deficient, nei shi, then you are likely to succumb to an invasion of du qi in your person, in your person body. So that is why it follows too that if you want to make sure that your righteous qi, your zheng qi, is not compromised, it also tells you to keep away from those who are infected, which is, in fact, in COVID-19, this is what we do. We are asked to keep physical and social distancing. So, in other words, you know, we already see in Zhongyi's classical texts that there are certain measures recommended as to how to prevent the spread, to increase the rate of transmission, so to speak, in today's terms, in biomedical terms. Now, I'll come back to this point in a minute. Why shi? Now, why shi, I said, refers to the greater environment out there. And for Zhongyi, what is the most important aspect of that external environment? It is this, when qi becomes unseasonal. And when you have unseasonal qi, some people translate it as unseasonal energetics. I don't. I think unseasonal qi suits me better. When that happens, then it is an indication that an epidemic would arise. So what is meant by unseasonal qi very quickly is this aspect of wai shi, is that in this winter, we expect the winter to be cold, right? And we expect spring, which follows, to be warm. But when you have a kind of inversion, when the preceding winter is warm instead of being cold, that's unseasonal qi, then followed by a spring, which ought to be warm, but turns out to be cold, this is the signal that an epidemic may occur. So this is how I understand it. I could be wrong here, but so that is my account of Nei Shi and Wai Shi. So in chapter 66, to back it up, I've come across, or I've read of other people about other people's accounts, that is, that in chapter 66 of Ling Shu, the second part of the Huangdi Neijing, it says, when two types of deficiency encounter each other, then this would then pathologically affect the person's body, the person body, right? So now then, with that, bearing that in mind, let's go to look at this particular diagram figure, which I have earlier drawn your attention to, this diagram. Now, if you look at this diagram, I cast it in my own language, my own discourse, as ecosystem nesting in terms of concentric circles. So this is a very simple example. I have only shown 3 concentric circles, and I call each circle an ecosystem. But if you look at this one, the first one, which I call ecosystem 1, is the smallest of the lot. It's in the center. And this is Zhongyi's term, would relate to pathogenic factor, which is the yi du, or the du qi. Now, the du qi must penetrate the person, individual, or the person who falls ill then becomes a patient. He must somehow become infected with the yi du. So that is the person, so ecosystem 2. And then the environment includes for me both the cultural and the natural or the physical environment in which the person lives. So that is ecosystem 3. And so you can say that ecosystem 1 is, as I say, yi du or yi qi, whereas biomedicine will talk of the virus called SARS-CoV-2 or MERS or whatever, or Ebola or whatever, or in the case of a bacterium, they will talk of tuberculosis, the bacteria of tuberculosis, but Zhongyi doesn't talk in those terms. Now, in ecosystem 2, that is what may be called the Nei Shi, but your Zheng Qi is not strong enough, then you succumb to this business up there. And the third then is the Wai Shi, where the ecosystem includes seasonal qi or unseasonal qi. When your natural environment includes unseasonal qi, then I'm afraid there may be an epidemic brewing. But if it is seasonal qi, then only 2 conditions may be satisfied, but not the third. So for an epidemic really to proceed, you must have a large swathe of a population which will succumb to this, succumb to that. Then when the person has succumbed, then of course, he or she becomes the patient, and the Nei Shi and the Wai Shi would all 3 would be present. In 1.6, it's a very simple-minded figure with all these 3 concentric circles. But Zhongyi It's much more complicated than that. So I have just, this I will talk about because this is how biomedicine understands itself when when cast in my language of concentric circles. So I've given it 10. So very quickly you can see, the smallest one, the inside one, is you can talk of atoms, and beyond atoms you can even talk of subatomic particles, but I forget about subatomic particles for the moment. Then the next concentric circle is your DNA molecules. Then your molecules, your protein made by these molecules form your cell. Your cell forms tissues, including muscles, and all these then together, and these cells also build up your skeleton. And so all together then the cells and the muscle and the tissue build up the organs, and the cell, tissue, skeleton, organs give you the entire body. Then the body, for Western medicine following Descartes, is all about the mind-body distinction. So there is dualism, whereas Chinese Zhongyi is not dualist, but dyadic. So it doesn't believe in the mind-body distinction in that dualist Cartesian sense. And then the external environment, which includes the temperature, whether you have enough nutrition, then whether you are sheltered properly, whether your shelter is adequate against extreme heat, extreme cold, etc. So that is, at best, Zhongyi's biomedicine possible understanding. Usually it stops, it's not too keen on 10. It concentrates on 2, 4, 5, 7, 8, 6, talking about food or shelter or temperature. Nutrition, the science of nutrition only becomes respectable of late, in the last 2 decades or so, or 3 decades at most. So in its history, it's not all that important, as it were. Now, so sorry about missing one concentric circle, but I'll give you the right one later. Now, and this is how Zhongyi sees itself. I have used also 10, but I deliberately put 10 there as empty, because beyond the lowest level that Zhongyi is interested in is tissue, muscle, and skeleton. It's not basically interested in DNA, right? And cells. So it talks a lot about tissue, muscle, skeleton. It talks about organ systems. It doesn't talk about single organs like biomedicine does. It talks of organ systems. So we speak of the spleen, stomach organ system. We speak of the lung and large intestine system, which we'll come back to later in understanding the present COVID-19 epidemic. And it talks about, the whole person, which includes a person, includes not only the person's, the body, but also includes the mind or the emotions, thoughts, feelings, etc. It's the whole person that you're talking about. So personhood is therefore, for Zhongyi and for Chinese philosophy, what I call a primitive concept. And it is very interested in the qi in Yu Zhou, which is the macrocosm, and its reflection or its existence as reflected in the microcosm in the person body. And so this is where your your why she comes from, right? It depends on what is happening in Yuzhou, as we saw in the earlier figure of the 3 concentric circles. It is also very, very interested, not simply in the immediate external environment in which a person lives, the kind of air, water, food, shelter, climate, because food for the Chinese as a form of as nutrition is very, very important. Lack of proper nutrition will lead to illness, etc., etc. So this is very, very important. Now, what is also very important for Zhongyi is the emphasis on the social cultural environment, because your family is very important, your tribe is very important. And today we talk of ethnic groups, and we also talk about the state, larger political entities such as the state. So for the Chinese, and we can see, of course, very quickly how COVID-19 was contained in China and controlled in China, because the policy at every level acted efficiently to contain the spread of the virus. But there is a tremendous infrastructure from the policy which enables China very quickly to contain the virus. So bear that always in mind. And then the larger social environment which the person lives, such as the Chinese always emphasize it, your mountains and your rivers, shan, he, and the plants and animals. The Chinese Zhongyi is all about collecting plants, herbs, for decoction, and animals, parts of animals to play a role in Zhongyi pharmacology, etc. And the cosmological environment, we have already talked about the qi in Yuzhou. So the Chinese are particularly, Zhongyi is particular, and Chinese cosmology is particularly interested in 3 heavenly bodies and the relationship between them, the sun, the moon, and the earth, and therefore we human beings living on earth and how we relate to these astronomical bodies. So this is my way of illustrating some of the immense differences between Zhongyi and biomedicine up there, right? Okay. Now we have done this one. We have done the 3 causal conditions. Now the question then arises, posed by some skeptics. I'm now playing the role of the so-called role of the devil's advocate. And that is to say, okay, you have talked about epidemics in China, for instance, in ancient China, and how the Chinese texts refer to the occurrence of epidemics. For instance, in the preface of Zhang Zhongqing's discourse, there is mention that in a particular 10-year period, there were epidemics which carried off, a large part of his old clan, and also that other texts, Chinese texts, also tell us that there were numerous epidemics occurring in Chinese history, beginning. The earliest record apparently is in the Zhou Li, and then the Han texts that we have just referred to, like Zhang Zhongqing's, Huang dating depends on how you date it. Some people date it as a Han text. Some people date it as a pre-Han text. But whatever it is, it's either a pre-Han text or Han text. So the Zhou is definitely a pre-Han text. So etc. And so all these texts that and then followed by the Tang Dynasty, the Song Dynasty texts, and the Qing Dynasty texts all talk about the occurrence of epidemics. So the skeptic then says, okay, you ancient Chinese texts do speak about epidemics, but do you actually, you're only talking about epidemics as an occurrence. But have you really got the concept of epidemic? Yeah, these are two different things, they maintain. Now, my short, quick answer to that kind of query is to say, yes, of course, it not only mentions the occurrence of epidemics throughout its long history in its texts, but also those texts, that some of which I've already cited, small passages from them, to show that they have also grasped the concept of epidemics. Now, the dictionary account that I mentioned right at the beginning shows that, you know, they already have the concept of epidemic as understood today. So I would say that if, and the dating that I was talking about earlier on, where in terms of my three simplified concentric circles, ecosystem 1, ecosystem 2, ecosystem 3, they've already given us 3 causal conditions which must be satisfied before the emergence of an epidemic. So that is evidence enough to say that they have grasped the concept of epidemic as today understood by in epidemiology and biomedicine, right? Now, furthermore, I want to add to it that they have indeed grasped this concept very thoroughly, because we have already referred to probably the notion of the strategy of physical distancing, keeping away, in other words, from people who are already infected, mentioned earlier in the Neijing. Other practices that which can also be mentioned to show that they have really grasped what an epidemic is, and therefore the nature of the concept of epidemiology is the practice of burying the dead to prevent the spread of disease. Now, this in the case of COVID is not probably relevant, but in the case of other types of epidemics, it is relevant. For instance, in Ebola, certainly, it's very important how you bury the dead, because you know, it could be when corpses are dressed, very often in an epidemic like Ebola, this can be passed to the relatives or those close to the deceased person who are addressing the corpse for disposal, for burial, etc. So in Chinese texts, as far as I know anyway, Buddhist monks, particularly in the Tang Dynasty, were recruited to bury the epidemic dead, the dead from epidemics. And the sweetener given to these monks by the government was that if they bury so many dead, then they would be given a license to preach. So Buddhist monks do that. So that was the Tang Dynasty. In the Han Dynasty too, there were special I think there were special designated places where you had to bury the dead. Now, there is also the measure of quarantine or isolation of those infected to contain the epidemic. And again, there are texts which show that the ancient Chinese and Zhongyi were well aware that this is an appropriate measure to use. That, for instance, there are special residences put aside as quarantine areas, so which are equivalent to the Fang Chang, which the Chinese government built at the height of the epidemic in Wuhan. So it's the same principle that the ancients used, which today, a year ago, was used again. So quarantine or isolation of those infected is a very important thing. And there's another text which I recall after the Han Dynasty, which says that if the court officials have in their family, if there are people infected, then they cannot come to court. They are exempt from attending court, because if they attend court, they will be bringing. They have to self-isolate. Today, we use the language of self-isolation. So the government of the day under that particular dynasty will then ask the official to self-isolate. So that they are, all these techniques can be found, therefore, in these ancient Chinese texts. Now, these are what today we call epidemiological methods. These methods are epidemiological methods. They are because they are non-pharmaceutical, right? Now, the question then arises about clinical measures. Do the Chinese or does Zhongyi use clinical medicine in order to treat such cases? Now, the answer, as far as I know, is yes. I mean, Shun Simiao, Tang, famous Tang theoretician and practitioner of Zhongyi, he always said, use two things when treating illnesses, and that is acupuncture plus herbs. Herbs, therefore, is decoction, right? Plants and animal ingredients. So you have to use them accurately and correctly, and you would be fine. Now, at this point, for what happened in Wuhan, I'm entirely relying on Liu Lihong, because I found that he has published a lot of things, which no doubt your readers, your listener audience will also have read, but just to bore them at the price of boring them, I'll just say something quickly for those who have not come across Liu Lihong's writing on this, because he and two others, forming a small private team, went to Wuhan in March to February. They arrived in February, the 21st of February, 2020, hoping to help. But because he had retired by then, and so he had no official standing anymore, and he said he found great trouble trying to get a hospital to take to let him in and to allow him to allow his team of 3 to treat patients. But finally, he overcome all these difficulties and managed to get into a hospital and to treat them. So how did he treat them? He treated the team treated them as Sun Simiao advised, using both acupuncture and decoction. Now, given the conditions when they arrived in Wuhan on the 21st of February 2020, you can imagine that the city was like a ghost city. There was nobody on the streets, everything was closed under lockdown. So obviously getting herbs for decoction would be a big problem. They overcame that problem in the end, but initially there were no herbs that they could get hold of. So what they did then was acupuncture, because they what Zhongyi practitioners always carry a box of needles with them. So they did that. And so now, without going into detail, because you can read the details in Liu Lihong's account that he has given, let us say very quickly, for those who don't know, as an example, that they needled a patient with chest stuffiness, and they needled the person at PC6, which is the neiguan on the wrist. They use a lot of the wrist shui positions, because the neiguan PC6 in particular is said to govern the chest and the stomach. And so at least Liu Lihong claims, to his surprise as well as to the surprise of the patient, when he needled a particular patient on arrival, when they did that at PC6 at the neiguan, the patient then immediately reported great relief. Now, that is one example. So there were other cases that they did, which one doesn't have the chance to talk about. So please go back and look him up, and you'll find it. And that and his write-up of his team's work, and you'll find it all there. Now, finally, when they got to get hold of herbs, they did use a decoction, and they use, in particular, I've just selected 1 or 2, 3 perhaps here, the Wuling San, which is already processed as powder, but it has this herb in emporia, and then a chai hu tang, which is the minor purpurum decoction, and the ma huang tang, which they also used. Now, apparently, in Liu Lihong's opinion, that is, the ma huang tang containing ephedra is really very, very effective. But because ma huang itself is a very, very powerful drug, and if you're not careful in the dosage used, you can kill the patient or does great damage to the patient. So that is why I think in America it is even banned, if I recall, this drug, this plant. But a Chinese prescription, you have got to be very, very, very careful. Apparently, you should not use more than 6 grams per day. The dosage have to be very, very small, but it is very, very effective. So, so much for that. Now, another strategy which one could use, I suppose, according and confirmed by Liu Lihong, is that because of, you remember when in the earlier figure, this figure, let me find it for you. In this figure, you see, I talk of, you have the organ systems. All the visceral organs form systems, the 五脏六腑. So because of the organ system concept, get back to it, because of the organ system concept, the lung is the 脏 and the 腑 is the large intestines. So while working on the lung, and if your strategy on the lung doesn't work too well, then you can also work on the large intestines by the concept of the lung, large intestines, visceral organ system. And you can use a variety of seeds, different kinds of seeds, which Liu Hong mentioned. And these seeds, because the seeds have the property of being able to moisten things. And so it moistens the phlegm caught in the lower respiratory tract of the person body, of the patient, and draws it out and then draws it down so that you can have and get rid of it that way. You expel it via bowel movements. So that is another strategy, apparently, one can use. So, and so it is quite amazing to conclude, it's quite amazing that not only are the concepts already, the concept of epidemiology already understood by Zhongyi in the ancient way back historically, the measures that they use, the non-pharmaceutical measures that they use, as well as the clinical methods that they use, are still relevant today and are still used. So Zhang Zhongjing's formulae are still used with modifications, of course. You must always modify formula intelligently and flexibly. Use those formulas in what the Chinese call a 灵活 manner. That means, nuanced manner, in a flexible, intelligent manner. And so to conclude, I think I would just simply say the striking feature, as far as I'm concerned, the striking difference between biomedicine as a medicine and Zhongyi as a medicine is that Zhongyi has this ability of, to be able to treat an illness, even though you know nothing about the illness, in terms of if you go back to ecosystem one. Now, in an epidemic today of COVID-19, we know what ecosystem one is, and it is this 毒气. But in many other types of illnesses, which have nothing to do with epidemics, but in illnesses in general, quite often you may not know, according to the what the so-called ecosystem one is, but it doesn't matter, because in Chinese, in Zhongyi, what you are dealing with is to use the 4 diagnostic methods, and in the light of your diagnosis using the 4 standard diagnostic methods, you come to a particular diagnosis. And when you come to the diagnosis, you know what to do, because the diagnosis almost, in a sense, entails the treatment. Example. So when you study the mind, for instance, when you ascertain the mind, when you look at the person's complexion, when you study the tongue diagnosis is very important, etc., then the practitioner will then come to a particular diagnosis, whether the patient is suffering from aversion caused by heat excess and therefore yin deficiency, or whether the patient is carrying a yin excess and therefore yang deficiency. Yang excess with yin deficiency is a aversion. So how do you treat aversion? You just try to get hold of ingredients in your pharmacology, heat clearing medicinals. So you use so that's no problem. And similarly, if it is a yin deficiency, a yin excess, a yang deficiency diagnosis, which is a hanzhen, then you use heat yang medicinals with yang properties. So I'll give you just one example to illustrate, in that sense, why it is a Chinese method or Zhongyi doesn't really require knowing what is so crucial to know in biomedicine. In the Qing dynasty, or in the Ming dynasty, there was a very, very distinguished theoretician called practitioner. I think he's called Miao Xiu. But what happened was, he was away at that time, but he had a very good friend. And while he was away from the area, his very good friend suffered from dreadful condition of constant, persistent diarrhea. No matter, the moment he had gone to the Maofang, to the loo, he comes out and he had to go back in again. So can you? Of course, he lost his appetite. He got thinner and so on and so forth. So you can imagine what a state he was in. When the physician came back and saw his friend in such a state, he just used the 4 diagnostic methods and ascertained that he was suffering from aversion. That means he was suffering from yang, excess of yang. So he gave him heat clearing medicinals, and he got rid of the condition. Right. Now then, much later on, in this particular household of the person who suffered from constant diarrhea, who was cured by his friend, it was a very large traditional feudal household, and so he had lots of concubines, minor concubines, major concubines, apart from his main wife. So one day, one of the concubines in a huff disappeared, went off. And when she went off, one of the servants in the household then informed the master and said, "Do you know why you had that illness? You succumbed to that constant diarrhea. That is because that particular concubine or ex-concubine of yours did it out of revenge, that before she put a handful of a particular thing called crouton, which is a ba dou, into the food that we were serving up. And the ba dou has this effect of producing constant diarrhea. So that was what you ate. We now dare tell you, because she's now gone. When she was there, we wouldn't. We wouldn't. So you say it is only in retrospect, which has nothing to do with the diagnosis, that one knew the cause, in the sense of the illness or that the person suffered from, that the patient suffered from. So it is this way. Whereas in biomedicine, you can't do that. You can use say in a cholera epidemic, you can use the non-pharmaceutical methods, epidemiological measures, like preventing people from using a particular pump because the pump was infected. But until you knew precisely what to do with the virus or the bacterium or whatever is toxic, and to produce a cure for it, there's nothing you can do clinically. Whereas the Chinese can immediately go into clinical treatment, either via acupuncture or via decoction. So I think, I mean, this is not as a criticism of biomedicine. Biomedicine has its own achievements, but it's just to show one of the important differences between biomedicine and Zhongyi. So you can see then, very, very roughly, that Chinese science, Chinese philosophy, Chinese medicine is what I call holism, holistic, and that it is basically several things. It is what I call ecosystem science. It is based not simply on thing ontology, because the Chinese, it's not that the Chinese are not interested in things, the Chinese are not exclusively interested in things, because to them a very important understanding rests on processes. So it is a combination, in other words, of thing ontology and process ontology. So sometimes I call it thing ontology cum process ontology. And that its causal model is not linear, monofactorial. It is non-linear, multifactorial, as presented, as implied in the Wu-Xing relationship. To end very, very briefly now on this note, the Wu-Xing system simply is a version of what we may call a complex cybernetic system. In other words, or systems thinking, because systems thinking is holistic thinking, but cybernetic thinking is that they're very complex relationship. But however, cybernetic thinking seems basically to talk more on negative feedback mechanisms and not so much on positive feedback mechanisms. But the Chinese Wu-Xing is actually both. It involves positive feedback mechanisms and negative feedback mechanisms. So you can see, to finish on a nutshell, how very, very different these paradigms of scientificity are. And so to go back to the Joseph Needham business, Joseph Needham, I'm afraid, I admire him a lot. He was right in many things, but on this thing he was wrong. The Chinese did develop science they did not develop modern science. They couldn't develop modern science because their philosophy is different. And hence they developed their own science, their own unique science, and their own paradigm of scientificity. So today we should be very grateful for the fact that of all the Chinese sciences, the most well-preserved is Chinese medicine. So because the texts, the basic texts are still there, and we can go back to excavate them, to explore them, in order to get a better understanding of what is meant by the Chinese paradigm of scientificity. So with that then, I think I better end my talk. Thank you very much.